There's a letter in the Kansas State Historical Society that most researchers walk past without opening. It was written in October 1901 by a school teacher named Edna Morse, who had been teaching in Osage County for 19 years. The letter is addressed to the county superintendent of schools. It is 2 pages long, and in it Edna Morse describes with careful and deliberate language why she intends to continue teaching from her original curriculum even after being told explicitly to stop. I found it because I was looking for something else entirely. I was tracing the adoption records of standardized textbooks across the Midwest between 1895 and 1910, trying to understand why the economic content in American classroom instruction shifted so dramatically in such a short window. The same question keeps pulling me deeper, but the further I went into those state archives, the more I realized the textbooks weren't the real story. The teachers were, because the teachers remembered what was there before, and a few of them wrote it down. What Edna Morse was told to stop saying was not radical. It was not dangerous by any reasonable measure. It was simply the economic history that American school children had been taught for the better part of 3 decades. The mechanics of how money was created, the historical relationship between land ownership and poverty, the documented record of who benefited when currency policy changed and who bore the cost. These were not opinions. They were the curriculum. And in 1901, across the country, quietly and without public announcement, they began to disappear. The timing was not accidental. 1901 was a year William McKinley was assassinated and Theodore Roosevelt took the presidency. It was a year United States Steel was incorporated as the largest corporation in the history of the world, capitalized at $1.40, $4 billion, a figure that exceeded the entire annual revenue of the federal government. It was a year that the consolidation of American industrial and financial power that had been building for 3 decades reached a kind of completion. And the question of what American school children should understand about how that consolidation had occurred became for the first time a question that the men who had accomplished it had both the motive and the institutional means to answer. To understand why 1901 matters, you have to go back to 1879. That was the year Henry George published Progress and Poverty, an examination of why economic depressions occurred and why poverty persisted alongside industrial growth. The book sold 3 million copies in a decade. For context, that was approximately 1 copy for every 20 American adults alive at the time. It was the second best-selling book in the United States behind only the Bible for a period in the 1880s. It was taught in schools. It was debated in churches. It was a lens through which a generation of American teachers understood and explained economic life to their students. George's central argument was specific and falsifiable. He contended that the concentration of land ownership was the primary mechanism by which wealth extracted from productive labor accumulated in the hands of those who produced nothing. He documented the pattern across historical economies, named the mechanism with precision, and proposed a remedy so straightforward that it terrified the people it would have affected. A single tax on land value, not on labor, not on production, on the value of land itself, which increased not because of anything the landowner did, but because of the community growing around it. It was not a fringe position. Andrew Carnegie called Progress and Poverty one of the most important books ever written before he changed his mind about saying so publicly. Politicians built careers on it. Teachers taught in as established economic history, because in 1880, it essentially was this as the curriculum Edna Morse was still using in 1901, and this is why the letter she wrote to her county superintendent is worth reading carefully. She had received, as had school teachers across Kansas, Ohio, Indiana, and a dozen other states, a new curriculum framework that year. The frameworks arrived through state education boards, which had begun receiving substantial organizational support from a network of philanthropic foundations that had not existed a decade earlier. The framing was always the same: modernization, efficiency, preparing students for the industrial economy. The new curriculum frameworks were thorough and well-produced. They specified content with a precision that earlier frameworks had not, and what they specified with equal precision was what should no longer be included. The economic history of monetary creation was gone. The documented history of deflationary policy in the 1870s and 1880s, which had transferred wealth from debtors to creditors on a scale that a generation of economists had called the greatest organized robbery in American history, was gone. Henry George's land value analysis was gone. The Greenback movement, which had proposed that the federal government rather than private banks should control the issuance of currency, was not merely deprioritized. It was reclassified as a discredited fringe position despite having elected governors, senators, and representatives across 14 states in the 1870s and 1880s. The Granger movement's documented record of railroad monopoly pricing, against which prairie farmers had organized and which had produced the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, was reduced to a footnote. The National Banking Act of 1863 and what it had done to rural credit availability was not taught at all. The chain of cause and effect connecting federal monetary decisions to farm foreclosure rates across the Great Plains, a chain that farmers themselves had understood well enough to build a national political movement around it, was replaced with a narrative about individual thrift and market efficiency that contained no mechanism and no names. What replaced it was not wrong exactly. It was simply incomplete in ways that benefited specific people. The new curriculum taught that markets allocated resources efficiently when left alone. It taught that wages reflected the productive value of labor. It did not teach who decided what productive value meant, who set the conditions under which that determination was made, or what the documented historical records showed about what happened to wages when workers had no organized alternative. It taught the conclusion. It removed the evidence that had led prior generations to question that conclusion. Edna Morse understood this precisely. In her letter, she writes, and I am paraphrasing, because the original document is fragile and the county only permits transcription, that she had been teaching her students to read economic history the same way she taught them to read any history, with primary sources, with documented cause and effect, with the understanding that someone always benefits from a policy decision, and that identifying who benefits is the beginning of understanding why the decision was made. She writes that she did not believe it was her function as a teacher to protect her students from conclusions that made powerful people uncomfortable. She believed it was her function to teach them how to reach conclusions at all. The letter was written in October. She was dismissed in December. Now consider the scale of what was happening around her. In 1902, John Rockefeller established the General Education Board with an initial gift of $1 million, eventually totaling $53 million over the following 2 decades. The stated mission was to promote education in the United States without distinction of race, sex, or creed. The actual function documented in the board's own published reports was to coordinate and standardize American schooling along lines that its founders considered appropriate for an industrial economy. Frederick Gates, Rockefeller's philanthropic advisor, wrote in 1906 that the object was to produce in the child a perfect knowledge of what he ought to do and also a will to do it. He was describing the function of school. He was not describing the function that Edna Morse believed schools served. In 1905, Andrew Carnegie established the Carnegie Foundation for the advancement of teaching with $10 million. One of its first projects was a pension system for teachers. This is remembered as an act of generosity. What is less discussed is the condition attached. To qualify for the Carnegie pension, a college had to adopt specific curriculum standards that the foundation considered acceptable. Curriculum control dressed as retirement security. The teachers who taught the old economic history were aging out. The teachers who would replace them would be trained in institutions that had accepted Carnegie's terms to secure Carnegie's money. This was not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. There were no secret meetings, no coded communications, no explicit agreement to suppress the truth. It was something more durable than a conspiracy. It was convergent interest. The men who funded the standardization of American education were the same men whose accumulated wealth the old economic curriculum explained, documented, and questioned. They did not need to coordinate. They needed only to fund. Go back to Kansas, back to Osage County in the winter of 1901. Edna Morse knew her students. She had watched them grow up in farming communities where deflationary currency policy had foreclosed their parents' land in the 1880s and 1890s, transferring to Eastern creditors at fractions of its productive value. She had watched families lose in 2 years what had taken a generation to build. And she understood from the economic history she had been teaching why that had happened and who had designed the conditions that made it happen. And she understood that if her students never learned that history, They would have no framework for recognizing it when it happened again. They would have only the story that markets were natural, that outcomes were deserved, and that poverty persisted because of failures of individual character rather than structural decisions made by people with names and addresses and specific financial interests. That is what she refused to stop saying. Not a theory, not an ideology. A documented pattern with named beneficiaries available in historical records traceable through congressional testimony and court filings and the archived correspondence of the men who made the decisions. She was not teaching radicalism. She was teaching the evidentiary standard she applied to everything else. Her students remembered her. That is the part of that stays with me. 3 of them wrote letters later in their lives, 2 of which have been located in county historical collections in Kansas. And they describe their teacher in nearly identical terms. They describe a woman who treated economic questions the same way she treated geological questions or biological questions, as things that had answers, and that the answers could be found if you knew where to look and what to look for. One of them writes that she was the only teacher he ever had who made him feel that the world could be understood, not simplified, not explained away, understood. He writes that after she left, the new teacher was perfectly kind and perfectly useless in that specific way. The students who sat in Edna Morse's classroom in 1901 were born around 1888. They would have been in their early 20s during the Panic of 1907, when J.P. Morgan essentially performed the function of a central bank by coordinating private capital to stop a financial collapse. They would have been in their 30s when the Federal Reserve Act passed in 1913, the legislative resolution of the monetary debate that their teacher had been forbidden to include in her curriculum. They would have watched with whatever framework they retained from those last years of the old curriculum, the same mechanisms their teacher had documented play out at national scale. Whether they recognized what they were seeing depended entirely on whether Edna Morse had gotten to them before December of 1901. The General Education Board published a document in 1913 titled The Country School of Tomorrow. In it, Frederick Gates writes with striking frankness that the aim of education is not to create independent thinkers, but to produce useful citizens who will perform the tasks society assigns them without friction. He did not use those exact words. But the document is publicly available, and the meaning is not subtle. The goal was a population literate enough to follow instructions, and not literate enough to question the instruction's origins. The old economic curriculum was incompatible with that goal because it taught origins. It taught that instructions had authors with interests, and that the interests could be named. There's a question I keep returning to. How many Edna Morses were there? How many school teachers in 1901 and 1902 and 1903 received those new curriculum frameworks and looked at what had been removed and understood immediately what the removal meant? How many of them wrote letters to their superintendent? And how many of those letters were preserved? And how many of those that were preserved by or have been read by anyone in the last 50 years? The Kansas State Historical Society has 1.4 million documents in its collection. They have been digitizing since 2003. Edna Morse's letter became searchable in 2019. Before that, it was in a folder labeled Educator Correspondence. Osage County 1890 to 1910. A folder that has been in the archive since 1948. 70 years in a folder. And if there is one Edna Morse in Kansas, there are 50 more in Ohio and Indiana and Nebraska and Iowa. Teachers who saw the curriculum change and understood what the change meant and wrote it down because that is what teachers do. They write things down and whose letters are sitting in state historical societies and county, courthouse basement, and university special collections waiting for someone to look in the right folder. The economic history that was removed in 1901 did not disappear entirely. It survived in the letters of teachers who refused to accept the new frameworks without protest. It survived in the memories of students who remembered being taught to ask who benefits before accepting any explanation of how the world worked. And it survived in the documented record of what happened to the American economy in the decades that followed. A record that makes considerably more sense when you know what the curriculum that preceded it contained. The archive is open. The documents are there. And somewhere in a folder that nobody has thought to check since 1948, a teacher is still trying to finish the lesson she was told to stop giving. The last school teacher who taught the original history did not lose because she was wrong. She lost because what she was right about was inconvenient to people who had recently acquired the institutional capacity to determine what American children would and would not be taught. That capacity is not diminished. What has diminished is our memory of what was taken.